Hello, and welcome back to the Alexander Society. This is a podcast where we discuss, history, heritage, you know, the. Anyways, we do that and we drink. Tim, how are you doing?
I am doing pretty good, Derek, since you didn't say your name.
Oh yeah, I'm Derek. I'm the host, one of the hosts.
Of what we are now dubbing the Alexander article episodes.
Yeah, that's a good name for these. I like to contrast with our mystery docket. I think that's a good change. I like that.
So, Derek, what are you drinking
Oh,
tonight?
what am I drinking tonight? In fact, okay, so I know I've been going to co-op a lot recently, and I know it's kind of like the low end of it. It is the Bud Light of craft beers as far as Oklahoma goes, but
I was about to say of Oklahoma
yeah,
beers.
but oh, they make so much good stuff though. Like, okay, so what I
I've been like, I would say all of their beer are acceptable. I haven't had a beer that I would not
oh,
finish from them.
absolutely, yeah,
I haven't had a beer that I would like make a regular beer from
yeah.
them though.
Yeah, I drink them casually the same way that other people drink shitty beers like Bud Light. They
That's
are
fair.
Bud Light for people with functioning taste buds.
Exactly.
What I'm drinking, this is Peach Pageant by Co-op Ale Works, Oklahoma City. This is as they say, a Berliner style Weisse ale with peaches. So it's a light ale with a peach flavor. And oh my god, you would actually love this because it tastes like a sour but like less sharp. If that It's a sour without the sour.
I like the
Yeah, but
sharpness of the sour.
yeah, and that's that.
It still reminds you
Yeah,
of the
like
sour
the
part, so I
fruity
get it.
part
Yeah.
of the sour. It is all that. And it tastes amazing. The peach is not like artificial or anything, and it's not like an overbearing or anything. You can still taste the ale, but it is perfectly blended with the peach. It is incredible how good this
Okay.
works. Like I'm definitely going back to this eventually. And then for my drink, I am a slut
You're
for
also a
peach.
slut for peach
Peach and green apple
and
are
green
the
apple.
two best fruit flavors, like hands down. Um, and
And a returning brand.
yeah,
Again,
this
also.
is something that I've drank before. Both of us have drank before. Florida Canya.
I haven't had that one before because that's a
Oh
lot more
yeah, since I
pricey
did
than I
have a
normally
little bit of
spend.
disposable income this week, I did decide to treat myself a little bit. I got Florida Canya rum, aged 18 years. This this rum
Fucking
is old
hell.
enough to enlist in the United States Army. I am so excited to try this stuff. I've already given it a smell. It even smells smooth. Oh yeah, you go ahead. Yeah, tell us what you're drinking.
So I stopped by our friend's Skydance again, not literally because I live so far away from the brewery, and my car is not good enough to make that trip very many more times. And got myself something that I figured would make Derek jealous. So somehow we themed our beers together and our liquor too. To be honest, I got Peach Pie Sour Ale by Skydance Brewing, a nice 6%. And then I'm not gonna lie, I didn't buy this because it was a rum. I bought this because it looks fucking amazing on the bottle. I got I got Bumbu rum. It's 35%, and it's a gorgeous little bottle. You'll have to look at one of our social media
Yeah.
posts because I always put our drinks in there. It's a tiny little bottle. It was a little bit expensive, but it's straight for the Caribbeans, and it smells like it's going to be delicious. I'm not going to lie. So me and Derek are both drinking peach beers and both drinking rum tonight.
Straight from the Caribbeans.
So, Derek, what are we talking about today for this special Black History Month episode?
Yeah, so it's History Month once again. So, what we're going to be talking about is concerning the Black American community, an individual that is very important to their history for a variety of reasons. And this was largely inspired by my reading of his autobiography, which is one of the most important books that I've ever one of the books that just after you get done reading it, it just changes everything about like the way you look at the world. It just the way I look at people too. It one of the most important books I've ever read. We're going to be talking about Malcolm X.
Malcolm X is actually someone I've heard about throughout history class, but we actually never genuinely covered in any
Yeah,
respectable capacity.
His story is both really like it has a lot of the same sort of hits that you hear from like a lot of civil rights leaders, but with just these wild, insane twists everywhere. Like, think of like the biography of any given like civil rights leader from this era, like all of the typical things that they deal with, that they do, but just add like the most incredibly insane think of like the most insane thing that could happen in any given situation and how that would shape a person and how that would develop a person's own perspective of the world and the world's perspective of them. And you get Malcolm X out of it. Just a a monolith of a personality in with really genuine, like a bizarre mix of like really genuinely revolutionary inspired ideals of equality, but like all mixed in with just these batshit insane ideas like spiritual ideas, religious ideas, perspectives on history, things like that. And it's not like tiny quirks that you like you mentioned, like, oh, such and such, this famous individual believe these weird things. Like, he can't just like put them. They're not weird quirks of his personality. They're central to who he was and the activism that he did.
They were central core beliefs that shaped the individual themselves. They motivated them.
It's better to just explain it. So real quick, we're going to go ahead and get into the rules. They're pretty simple rules.
So rule number 1, anytime white people do their thing, we're going to take a sip.
Rule number 2, anytime the Nation of Islam do their thing, we take 3 sips.
And rule number 3, anytime cops do their thing, we'll do what, Derek?
We're going to take a shot. Speaking of shots.
Cheers.
Prost.
Ooh. Wow. That is my favorite rum, period. Hands down my favorite rum. Like, metaphorically speaking, I have a Woody for this rum. Metaphorically speaking.
Literally speaking, I'm getting a Woody for this rum. Oh my god.
There is, like, more vanilla flavor in that than I would have figured, but, like...
This rum is so smooth, I could drink it like soda. All of the alcohol, it goes right down with the rest of the drink. And I get all of the sweetness when it hits the tongue. And then after it goes down, I just get the barrel. I get the oak.
Okay, sweet. That sounds amazing.
It is so perfect. So, there was a boy who was born on May 19th, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, by the name of Malcolm Little. Young Malcolm was the fourth of 7 children. His father was Earl Little, who was a Baptist lay preacher, who was basically he was a preacher, but he wasn't like an ordained. He spoke. Basically, he was a speaker. Like, he wasn't ordained as a preacher by the Baptist church. He just went out and spoke. That's what he did, and he was kind of locally famous for it. He was a really good public speaker, very very devoutly religious man, that kind of thing. His mother was Louise Helen Little, who was she was just a homemaker. She was born in Grenada, which is in the yeah, it's island in the Caribbean. Um, Obviously, black family. Um, both of his parents were active in. Um, it was an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And by the way, I'm going to be saying Negro sometimes. It I it I'm not gonna say it in my own descriptions, just in quotes or in names of organizations. It's not a good thing for a white person to say.
It's not a word we prefer to use
Yeah,
anymore.
when I'm
However, we're talking about history, and history has those words within
yeah,
it.
when I describe black folk, I'm gonna call them black folk or African Americans or something like that. It is what it is. It's the word has its context when white people say it now. I get that and I understand that. This is just going to be in the context of uh, what the organizations and these quotes, what they were. Um, but yeah, they were both involved in the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was it was the first prominent black nationalist and pan Africanist organization. So black nationalism it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a movement of, generally speaking, black Americans, although it has all often included like black folk from other nations as well, um, kind of forming and recognizing their own sort of nationhood separate from like white America. Um, and Pan Africanism is this movement around like uniting all black communities and nations, both in Africa and in the diaspora, into like a unified force to fight for their own interests against like European imperialism, American racism, things like that. And this organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, it was the very first one to get real prominence with under these art ideologies, under this early black nationalist activist named Marcus Garvey. The year after Malcolm was born, this family had been pretty persistently harassed constantly by the local branch of the KKK in Omaha, which during this time in the 1920s, the KKK were significantly more powerful than they were ever before and have ever been since. This was when they were like a political party with like national membership. There were some states in the country where the entire political apparatus was just owned by the KKK, and they had significant like mainstream legitimacy in American politics. Um, and the little family were just constantly being harassed by the local branch because of their activism. And so the year after Malcolm was born, they ended up moving to try and get away from this. Unfortunately, they didn't move far enough because they were still in America. And they ended up accidentally moving somewhere where it ended up being worse. So they,
Of
which
course. Fucking
which
America.
based on black history, you'd think it'd get better the further north you got. It actually got worse. So they ended up in Lansing, Michigan. And in Lansing, the KKK didn't have a very strong presence in Lansing because all of the white supremacists in Lansing were too extreme for the KKK. And
Too extreme for
yeah,
the KKK in its
heyday.
heyday?
Well, the thing is, in its heyday was when it was the most moderate. That's when they were using elections to oppress black people rather than like regularly using outright violence. They still use lots of outright violence, don't get me wrong, but they focused a lot on like political activism, like getting elected and passing laws that restricted black people's ability to vote and things like that. So the Black Legion was basically like this more militant offshoot of the KKK. So it was these fucking assholes, white supremacists that were like, they thought that because the KKK was so mainstream during this period of time, they were all like politicians, and I don't think I explained before, but like it was practically like more of like a political like social club for like middle-aged men, white men.
See,
That
that's the part I kind of have trouble separating. That our modern understanding of the KKK versus what it was back then.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, and don't get me wrong, like they were still doing like terrorist violence and intimidation stuff and things like that, but it was more like imagine like a really morbid sort of like the VFW putting on like a picnic or a cookout at a public park or something like that. Like that's what lynchings
so
were.
like the American Legion with a racist tinge,
Kind of, yeah.
a more racist tinge.
Yeah, it's like a local political party putting on like a cookout at the park. That is basically what like Klan lynchings were at this point. It would, and that's not an exaggeration. Like it was they were actually like picnics. Like people would come out and like they'd have lunch and they'd have a fun afternoon watching a mob like hang an innocent person from a tree. It genuinely just turning a heinous crime against humanity into like a family gathering. Fucking horrible shit. And the Black Legion were they thought that that was a bit too pedestrian. They thought that they thought that that sort of clan was a little too liberal, and so they broke off and they formed this crazy militant form of the KKK that were going back to kind of their roots of just like hooded figures riding onto black folks' property in the middle of the night, dragging them out of their homes, doing shit like that.
Yeah, you didn't really give me that context. It's like I get this the idea that I have of like the past KKK as I think of the people who were doing the cross burnings, the people who were lynching, and like a very mobile racist group.
Yeah, that so the clan kind of had like a few iterations. So like the original clan was made up of like Confederate veterans after the Civil War. And
Which I kind of am not surprised by. It like makes logical
yeah.
sense.
Yeah, and to give you an idea of like why the KKK is the way it is, all of the guys who formed the first iteration of the KKK, if they were alive today, would be the guys at the game store, like the D&D players that on like D&D night that made everybody at the table uncomfortable. And
It's one of those people that are so far into role play that it fucks with the entire group, and they're like, let's not let him know the next session's time.
right, exactly. Except during this time, the version of that was political violence and intimidation against racial minorities. And that I don't know if that makes me a bad person to make that comparison, but it like it's true. They were fucking dorks who were also just crazy, violent, and bigoted. And then like the second iteration of the clan was this sort of like more politically mainstream, well polished, like guys in business suits on Capitol Hill sort of racism that also partook in lynchings on occasion. But you didn't you didn't really need like an organized group to do lynchings during that time, but that's another discussion.
I always saw lynchings as like a mob mentality kind of thing, not like an organized thing.
Yeah, it really depended. Like most of the time, it was like a mob sort of thing, like just a bunch of angry white people, kind of like like breaking into a jail to drag out a black man who had just been arrested after being like accused of whistling at a white woman or something. And
That's even fucked up. Just whistling at someone,
oh,
like
that happened so often. That was a really like whistling, catcalling, hitting on like white women was a really common way to get yourself for a black man to get himself lynched back then. It was that was a really common excuse. Like the Tulsa uh the Tulsa race massacre, the race riot, whatever.
the ending of Black Wall Street, 1812. Was it?
1812. No, it was
No, not 1812. 1912. Sorry.
1921. Yeah,
Why did I think I had the right numbers in the wrong order? I guess.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, that began because and that began because there was a black man who was like on an elevator with a white woman, and somebody claimed to have heard her scream as he was leaving the elevator, and what likely happened was that like the elevator jolted as it was, and he kind of like stumbled and lost his balance and fell onto her, and she started screaming, and that's how the Tulsa race riot began. Was a bunch of white people that were angry after he got arrested. They tried to like break into the prison to drag him out and lynch him, and then when the police refused to let him be taken, they just went over to Black Wall Street and burned the whole place to the ground. Like accusations of sexual crimes were a really common excuse to enact like mob violence onto black men.
I really hate how low the bar was to enact violence on African Americans was
Yeah,
because it really puts shame on your like on like our entire race, to be honest. Like it's legitimately frustrating.
yeah, it's incredible. But imagine imagine that, but better organized and way worse, and you get the Black Legion. And these are the guys that are kind of harassing the little family when they move to Lansing, Michigan. When Malcolm is 6 years old in 1931, his father dies under mysterious circumstances. And they're not, okay, they're not as mysterious as they are, as it is often made out to be, especially at the time. The coroner's report on Earl Little's autopsy declared his death to have been caused by being run over by a streetcar. That he stepped in front of a street trolley and was killed because of it. But the police refused to release his body to the family, and so they never knew exactly how he died. It is very likely, and the Little family definitely believed he was killed by like a mob of white supremacists, that they had caught him in the street. So yeah, Malcolm, his father, is killed when he's 6. Later on in 1937, he's 12 years old. His mother, who has been raising seven kids on her own. She has a
7 kids,
yeah,
Jesus Christ.
as a black family in the 1930s. Remember, this is the Great Depression we're talking about. She
I
has
totally forgot that was the same time period.
Yep. Yeah, his dad dies. The main moneymaker for the family dies right as the Great Depression is starting.
God dang.
Yeah,
That's
this family.
this is the adopted family, right?
No, this is his actual. No,
Okay.
he's only with his foster family for like 2 years.
Okay.
And he ends up with his foster family because his mother has a nervous breakdown and is admitted to psychiatric quote unquote care. What passed for psychiatric care in the 1930s. And this is when he's 12, and he's put into the foster care system. And he moves in with a kindly liberal white family who want to do good by the black community and take in some black kids in need, take care of them, provide them with a better life. Still very racist people, but a shared like a paternalistic sort of racist as opposed to like an exterminationist sort of racist. So yeah, as he's growing into like his teenage years, he starts to it becomes very obvious that he is an extremely intelligent young man. He does really well in school, and he starts to think about like his future, what he wants to do once he gets out of school, and he settles on he wants to become a lawyer. And he decides on this course of action after learning about law and things like that from one of his teachers, a white teacher. Um, he goes to this. He goes with this desire to his foster parents, and his foster parents tell him, "Oh no, you can never do that. You're black. You can't. Black people don't become lawyers. They can't do that." And so he goes to his teacher, who he looked up to and revered as like his mentor. And his teacher tells him, "Inwards don't become lawyers," to his face. So after this sort of discouraging experience of his, being told by all of the adults in his life that he can't be successful and industrious and what's the word ambitious, specifically because he's a black man, um, and this coming from specifically people who purported to be liberals who cared about the plight of black folk in the United States was a bit of a formative experience for him. For the rest of his life, he would talk. One of his quotes that I come back to a lot is that he once said that he likes conservatives better than liberals because at least conservatives are honest about their racism. So yeah, he's in this situation. He's living in foster care for a couple years, and then when he's 14, he moves to Boston, and he moves in with his half sister Ella, and they live in the black neighborhood of Roxbury. So he stays there for a few years, kind of working odd jobs, stuff like that. He's not going to school anymore. He drops out pretty soon after moving to Boston. And then later on, when he's 18, he moves to Harlem in New York City. And this is 1943, so like right smack in the middle of World War II. This is true. American troops are in Italy at this point, and they're less than a year out from landing in France. So, well, when he gets to New York City, he has like he hops like back and forth around a few different like regular normal jobs. Like he works at a rail line for a little bit. He works as like dishwashers in a couple of restaurants, things like that. Um, at one of these restaurants, Jimmy's Chicken Shack, he works along another black man whose nickname was Chicago Red. And he was called Chicago Red because he was from Chicago and he had like red hair. And then Malcolm comes in. He's working at the same place, and he has red hair too. And so they start calling him Detroit Red because he's from Michigan, even though he never lived in Detroit. Um, and so that's how he got his nickname. That's what everybody knew him as when he lived in Harlem during this period. Everybody called him Detroit Red. And then, like I mentioned before, later on, Chicago Red, like later in life, he's going to become the famous comedian Red Fox. So, like I said, this is during World War II. The draft board in New York City tries to draft him into the army. His number comes up, and they bring him in for like his medical like examinations and stuff. And in order to keep from getting drafted and having to join the army, um, he pretends to be mentally unstable. And the way he does that is by telling the psychologist or the guy doing like his entrance
His psyche valve.
yeah, um, basically tells that guy, yeah, if I end up in the army, I'm gonna be organizing all of the black troops to just go AWOL and just start killing any white person they see. And it worked. He's declared mentally unfit to serve in the military. So while he's living in New York, while he's doing these odd jobs, he starts making money by less less nice beans. He starts getting into like some crime shit. And not like the good kind of crime, like stealing from rich people. Though he does do that too. That's what he eventually gets arrested for. But at this point, he's doing stuff like racketeering, armed robberies. He's uh, like drug dealing. Very he does a little bit of pimping very briefly. Just like actual like real like morally reprehensible stuff. Um, but he's only stays in he only stays in Harlem for a couple years. He eventually moves back in with his sister in Boston. And when he gets back to Boston, he starts making some more money doing crime. And this is when he starts robbing white people or like rich white people. So when basically what he'd do is he'd wait for like some big event in the city when he where he knows like a bunch of rich people are going to be, and then when they're all out for the evening, he will go into the rich neighborhoods, find some houses where the lights are off, and he and his crew would break in and steal anything that wasn't nailed down, and then leave, and nobody would see them do it. And this works for a few months. He makes a pretty good killing off of this particular line of work. But he is eventually caught and he's arrested and he's sentenced to 10 years in prison. And his time in prison is going to be when everything changes in his life and he gets set on the trajectory that eventually makes him the icon Malcolm X. While he was in prison, he was famous amongst all the other prisoners because of how much he hated Christianity. Like he always talked about like how much he hated Christians and how much he hated the Christian religion because he associated it so much with like um all of the well-to-do white people who had made his life hell like up to this point.
I
Um
can't necessarily say I blame him. It feels like a lot of people in power slash who do shitty things blame it on the religion.
yeah. Like the KKK, for example, is an explicitly Christian organization. Like like the whole Christian thing is a pretty big part of their thing. Like it's why they burn crosses. It's like it's not like a burning crosses because they hate the cross. It's like it's a symbol of like uh, Christ's might uh, and his favor of like the white race or some shit like that. Clan shit doesn't make fucking sense. But his nickname in prison was Satan. The other prisoners called him Satan.
Fucking Christ. What kind of monster must he have been in prison?
It wasn't because he was like, I mean, he was actually kind of an asshole in prison, but like not any more than any of the other prisoners. Like people are just assholes in prison because that's it's prison. Um, but it was mainly just because he just very publicly and loudly hated Christianity, um, which which was kind of a thing because even like black people are like black people even in prison, like there's a lot of Christians, like a lot of Christian black people. Like they frown on that too a little bit. So while he's in prison, he starts getting letters from his brother Reginald, one of his brothers, because he's got a whole bunch of siblings. But one of them, Reginald, starts telling him about this great new thing that's starting to happen in the black community. It's called the Nation of Islam, and the I'm just gonna go over the Nation of Islam's belief very briefly. In broad strokes, they believe that they're kind of imagined the Nation of Islam as like they are to the Muslim religion as the uh, as the Mormons are to Christians. So they believe all of the same stuff. They've just tacked on a whole bunch of extra stuff on top of it that make them sound like 10 times crazier. And the stuff that the Nation of Islam has tacked on to regular Islam is on the more a little bit more like understandable and positive side stuff like black self determination, um, international black solidarity, Pan Africanism, that kind of idea, um, black self reliance, black liberation, and then on the other end is a bunch of crazy theories about the origins of the human race that include like a lost civilization of uh, black pre like black precursors in prehistory with like this advanced technological civilization that was
It's
just
basically the complete opposite to that. Oh, that is it the Anunnaki or like that the idea that civilization started in Antarctica and moved to the mainland, kind of racist white thing. The
yeah, yeah, it's
opposite
actually
end to that.
yeah, it's actually very similar to like those theories about like the Anunnaki and the Hyperboreans and like the white supremacists, like all of the white supremacists who believe that there was uh like one like hyper advanced race of like genetic supermen who ruled the world in prehistory but were destroyed, and now the only remnants of them left are white people. It's kind of like that, except it's black people. And these black people were Muslim and spoke Arabic, and their civilization was brought down by one guy named Yaqub, who was a scientist who used genetic engineering and selective breeding to invent white people, which were just black people but without souls, which is why they were white, and used them and created them with the sole purpose of destroying everything good and righteous on the face of the earth. These Nation of Islam beliefs are what um, Malcolm is introduced to these by his brother in prison, and to kind of get more information about it, he starts a correspondence with the leader of the Nation of Islam, this guy named Elijah Muhammad. And Muhammad it encourages him to reject his sinful past of crime and degeneracy, and pray to God for forgiveness, and he'll find a path to a greater life and a greater calling. And so that's what he does, and he converts and he changes his name from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X.
And this
And
is where me actually remembering your last story. He does this to cast off his uh, white / colonizer last name, because that's not historically / lineagely speaking's last name, because that came from the people who enslaved his ancestors.
right, yeah. In his own words, uh, Quote, "For me, my ex replaced the white slave master name of Little, which some blue eyed devil named Little had imposed upon my paternal forebears." So he converts while he's in prison, and then he is paroled in 1952, and he's released. And he moves to Chicago, where he is taken under the wing of Elijah Muhammad, and Muhammad becomes like sort of his mentor. And Muhammad immediately recognizes like he's a really, really good public speaker. He's very charismatic. He's very attractive. He's a very intimidating figure. He's 6'3", built like a marble statue, like a Greek statue. He's a very striking image, and he has the all of the oratory skill to go with it. And so he puts him to work, makes him a minister, sends him to Detroit, makes him a minister. He spends a little while in Detroit, kind of preaching to the flock there, and he starts bringing in crowds of hundreds of people, whereas before they had maybe a few dozen. They're now packed and they're running out of room in their temple.
So what you're saying is Malcolm X was a true orator of professional skill, naturally.
Yeah, just at his core, he's just really good at talking to people.
That's what like for the audience at home, an orator is someone who professionally speaks. I'm assuming I'm saying it right.
Orator.
Yeah, something like that. I said orator, but like
Orator, yeah. I knew what you were saying. Yes, he had very good oratory skills. And so Muhammad realizes like we that uh, they could put his skills to really good use by sending him all around the country and using him as like a recruitment tool. And so that's what he ends up doing is
that is a genius move on their part. I'm not gonna lie.
yeah,
Also, I'm gonna count that as our Islam is doing their thing,
yeah, sure.
which we probably should have stepped a while ago. But hey ho,
Yeah.
3 of them to be precise.
So yeah, he's bouncing from city to city, preaching, setting up new temples everywhere he goes. Boston, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Springfield, Missouri. Goes out west, a few cities in California, and because of his oratory skills and how good he is at recruiting new members, the membership of the Nation of Islam shoots up nationally. From when he first entered, it was like 1,200 people. It shoots up to like 20,000 people. I've seen some numbers go as high as like 40,000 during the couple years that he starts doing this. And the stuff that he's preaching about, he's of course talking about like white people are devils, black people must separate and prepare the way for God's return when He will smite all the white people and the black race can recreate our utopia on Earth. That kind of thing.
So the Nation of Islam believed that God had previously essentially came down in a similar manner as Jesus and acted as a prophet multiple times through history. I can't remember the specific people they said, but they believed that through their movements and in believing that the black people should be separate from the white people, God would eventually come back again, and that he would smite the white.
Yeah, basically. You left out the mother plane. Yeah. The mother plane is the UFO. Yeah. Yeah. God. So they believe the most recent incarnation of God on Earth was the founder of the Nation of Islam, who is this guy named Wallace Fard Muhammad. And when he died, Elijah Muhammad took over, and they believe that Wallace Fard Muhammad is going to come back on a UFO. It is literally like Elijah Muhammad describes what it is in detail. In detail, and I think even like later on, Louis Farrakhan also like describes the same thing. It's like it is a it is a disc shaped plane, which is made of solid gold. He specifically gives the number 15 million. It shows the dating with the inflation. $15 million worth of gold, which seems kind of low, but I guess it was about, I don't know, might have been right for the time. And made and bolstered with a metallic alloy or of a version of steel which is unknown to modern science. And he will come back on this flying saucer mother plane and use it to smite all the white people from the face of the earth.
I said anything remotely close to that from the white perspective, they'd be called insane, racist, and delusional. If not locked up for a grippy sock vacation.
Yeah, and they'd probably be right to do so.
I'm not saying you're wrong.
But yeah, that is what the Nation of Islam believes. So yeah, alongside all of like the white people being devils and the black separatism stuff, his speeches and his sermons, he was also preaching like sort of like conservative social values. So stuff like like preserve like preserve like your rightful family hierarchy. Like he was very big on like the whole patriarchal sort of thing, like as in like a good Muslim black man should be like a strong head of his family, and should show love but also like strong firm discipline to his kids. Believed in like stay away from like casual sex and drugs and alcohol and stuff like that. Work hard, start a business, that kind of stuff like that. Stuff that but he wasn't doing it as like a prove the white people wrong sort of way. It was more like do it for your own dignity because you owe it to yourself and to your kids and to your wife. It was that sort of thing. Be 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 good and like be good and wholesome for your own sake because it's good for you, not because you're trying to prove something. Exactly. Yeah. Don't do it for Whitey. Do it for yourself. Which is, I think we can all. That's words we can all live by. This is the kind of preaching he's doing. Very very conservative. He's definitely not like a sort of left wing guy. He's kind of presented as like a left wing guy because a lot of left wingers, like radical left wingers today, present him as like use him as like a left wing icon in the United States because he was like a black liberationist, and that's often been like very strongly associated with the left wing for obvious reasons. But he was like a conservative of a type, not like a white American conservative, but still a conservative. And that I have my issues with a lot of conservative like social values, but like saying those things he was saying was like love your kids, stay healthy, and build a strong community, which like fuck yeah, obviously. So while he's going around doing these preaching, setting up new temples, recruiting people everywhere he goes, he meets a young woman by the name of Betty Sanders in 1955, And the two of them, they have like a Nation of Islam sort of courtship, and
What
and
does that look like, by the way?
um, basically like all of their dates, they can't be like one-on-one dates. So like they have to have like it's an old
Double
style
dates? Or like how so?
like having their dates in like at like Nation of Islam events where there's like lots of other people around them. It's never like a one-on-one like private personal thing. Um,
How are you supposed to get to know them on a deep personal level in a social setting in which you are in a religious fashion? Whatever.
yeah,
I guarantee people have done worse with better.
yeah,
Whatever.
yeah. That's how like traditional courtships go. It's thousands of years old. It yes, it, it do what it do.
If you
Um,
don't know someone in like my final words on it, like if you don't know what someone's like in private before you tie the knot with them, you don't truly know them.
yeah, but that's coming from the perspective of like we we get into a relationship because it's fulfilling for us, not when whereas in this situation in their context, the purpose of marriage is
Procreation.
for procreation to continue your lineage uh, and to further propagate your race, but also because family units are the building blocks of a community in their ideology.
See, I've never seen marriage as just like either a way to procreate or like to be a member of community. I've seen it as this is the person I want to spend the rest of my life with, and I want to show them the level of commitment that says, hey, I want to be with you so much that I want to make it hard if I ever lose feelings to leave. Because that means it's truly and wellly done.
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, the two aren't wholly incompatible. Um, it's not preferable. It doesn't make the sort of utilitarian approach to marriage good, but they're not incompatible. Like you can marry because you can marry because you want to. You can like marry for like ideological or like political or economic reasons and still like genuinely love your partner and want to spend the rest of your life with them, which I is the case with Malcolm and Betty, like that they genuinely loved and cared for each other until the day that he died. Um, so you know it, it's not a good or bad thing. It's just complicated.
It's just a different way of looking at it than us.
Yeah. So the two would be married in 1956, and they would ultimately have six children together, all daughters. On April 26, 1957, there were three members of the Nation of Islam in New York City, which is where Malcolm X and his family. It's where they lived. They lived in Harlem, um, and he was in town. He wasn't out on one of his recruiting missions at this time. There were three members of the Nation of Islam who were walking down the street together in New York City, and they came across a police officer who was in the process, or a couple police officers who were in the process of beating a black man with nightsticks. Upon coming across this, the three men approached the cops, trying to intervene, and one of these men, Hinton Johnson, screamed, "Quote, you're not in Alabama. This is New York," while he was trying to stop the cops. Um, the cops then proved the foolishness of his words by turning around and beating on him instead. He was beaten so badly that he suffered brain contusions, and a subdural hemorrhage, which that basically means internal bleeding and brain damage.
Mm-hmm.
And after the beating, all three of the men were arrested and taken into custody without taking Mr. Johnson to the hospital. Malcolm, once he heard that this had happened, rushed to the police station where they were being held, and he demanded that he be allowed to see these men. At first, the police said no, and then somebody pointed out that currently, as they speak, there is a crowd.
Let's go ahead and take 3 sips.
Let's go ahead and take 3 sips because this is genuinely legendary.
Honestly, it's some ballsy shit that I respect.
Yeah,
Even if I don't respect the origin of the religion,
yeah,
because like
it's
some like race based BS, and I don't really, for one, I don't really respect most religions. Like I respect the individuals within a religion, but I don't respect a lot of religions.
So he demanded to see the arrested men, and he was refused. And then they noticed that a crowd of 500 members of the Nation of Islam were gathered outside the police station in an angry mob. The police, who at this point were now fearing for what that mob might be inclined to do, decided to go ahead and let Malcolm in to take a look at the men, just make sure they were okay. And upon seeing Mr. Johnson, immediately demanded that he be taken to the hospital, and they allowed it. And so he left with Mr. Johnson. They went to the hospital. He got treated, stayed for a few days, and then Malcolm brought him back to the police station as he promised to do. Upon arriving back at the police station, despite it being a few days later, the crowd outside of the police station had grown from 500 people to about 4,000.
Almost 10x's in size.
Yeah,
For fuck's sake.
yeah, it is. It is nearly an order of magnitude larger. And Malcolm was able to leverage the crowd to force the cops to arrange bail for the other 2 men that had been arrested. However, he was not able to negotiate to have Mr. Johnson released. So, after reaching this stalemate with the police, Malcolm walks out of the station onto the top of the steps leading up to the front door and looks out over the crowd, and he raises a single hand in sort of like a wave at them, just a single hand motion. And the entire crowd immediately falls silent and disperses and returns to their homes. And
That's impressive that he was able to disperse the crowd that quickly. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, it is a testament both to his personal magnetism and leadership, and also to the organizational skills, or the organization of the Nation of Islam. And when I tell you that this scared the shit out of the cops, would be the understatement of the century. They were fucking terrified by how much power Malcolm had.
It doesn't matter who you are. You would be scared as shit if you encountered that.
A single man dispersed an angry mob with a wave of his hand. That is terrifying. And the news caught wind of it, and the entire American news cycle lost their collective minds. This was a genuinely terrifying thing for white America in the 1950s. And so that is how both Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam became nationally famous. This is how everybody knew about this man and this organization, and his sort of reputation as this figure was cemented by a documentary that was made. I forgot which news source it was. It was one of the major like national news sources. Made a documentary about the Nation of Islam, specifically focused on the ministry of Malcolm X. It was called "The Hate That Hate Made."
Not an inaccurate title,
No,
but kind of reductive.
it's reductive, but man, that title goes hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, so after this documentary came out, this kind of cemented like the national fame of both the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X himself. Um, After this, he started making a bunch of public appearances, public speeches, news interviews that were kind of like outlining his beliefs and the beliefs of the Nation of Islam. All this stuff about black self determination. He started offering like a more militant, more kind of scary to white people version of what the civil rights movement was doing. Um, oh, excuse me. He kind of denounced the civil rights movement, which was just starting to become like come into its own. This was right around the same time that Martin Luther King Jr. was starting to become like a national name.
Well, it's kind of because the civil rights was the polar opposite of what he was advocating for, wasn't it?
Kind of, yeah. Civil rights was really focused. Like their big thing was like enfranchisement. It was removing all of the laws and all of the impediments to black voting. That was like kind of a central thing. Because even though black people could vote legally, there were a bunch of laws that were still considered constitutional and a bunch of practices that were restricting the ability for a lot of black people to vote. And Malcolm X kind of believed that voting was useless. He believed that it was surrendering to the white political system, and that the only way for black people to gain their rights was to just completely separate themselves from that system. And so trying to earn like the complete right to the vote was he kind of saw as like conceding ground to the white devils, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah. He referred to Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington as the farce on Washington. He called Martin Luther King Jr. a chump. And specifically in reference to the March on Washington, he said, quote, "It was run by whites in front of a statue of a president who has been dead for 100 years and who didn't like us when he was alive." In reference to the March on Washington, when Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, he did it in front of the Lincoln Memorial.
I feel
So
like I
there's
knew that, but didn't at the same time. Like in my head, I see that I've never watched the "I Have a Dream" speech. I've seen pictures of him, but I never made the connection. But it makes total sense if you get what I'm saying on that.
yeah. He this is where we get into kind of the shittier things that Malcolm did during his life. He was very anti-Semitic, and which was
It sounds like the Nation of Islam was just anti-Semitic in general. So I kind of
oh
assumed.
yeah, it's very anti-Semitic, and it Malcolm was kind of I don't want to call him the sole reason it was, but he is kind of the impetus for the introduction of like your stereotypical sort of anti-Semit, like conspiratorial anti-Semitism into the black community in the United States. A lot of black folk in the United States still have like this sort of prejudice against Jewish people because it was kind of introduced into their culture by Malcolm, which is really shitty. It was Malcolm X that first introduced. Okay, so you haven't heard of the Protocols of Elders of Zion before.
No.
Okay, so back in 1905 in Russia, anti-Semitism was really big. There were pogroms like once a year, where entire towns full of Jewish people would just be lynched and driven out of their homes and forced to flee the country, stuff like that. And it was institutional. There was a lot of that stuff, like in the imperial government in Russia. And in order to kind of facilitate this and to kind of at the same time stir up like public discontent against like the blossoming like socialist and communist movements in Russia, the the czarist secret police they were called the Okhrana, secret ghost published a document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which purported to be the minutes from a meeting where a bunch of leaders of the Jewish community from around the world met in secret in order to discuss their plans on uh, how to like overthrow the nations of Europe and to institute like a mass purge of Christians and overthrow like the civilized world by using like degeneracy to undermine the social values of these nations and using communism to urge the masses towards disobeying their rightful leaders. And this this document spread like wildfire. The way that I describe it is this document is basically like cholera, but for a social system. It does to like a society what cholera does to a human body. You drop it in, and it infects everybody in a community, and just spreads like virulent anti-Semitism and makes the entire society just lose their minds in like conspiratorial, like paranoia. It is one of the most destructive pieces of literature that has ever been produced. It was cited by a lot of Nazi leaders as like proof that the Jews were trying to destroy the Aryan race. It's been cited by every anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist that has ever lived since then. And it genuinely just one of the worst things that has ever happened to the collective human psyche. And it's pervasive. It's everywhere. Anywhere you can find conspiracism or anti-Semitism, it has its roots at some point in this document. And Malcolm X introduced the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to the Nation of Islam. And that is unforgivable. That is not to be defended. It is not to be explained away. That is undeniably, without reservation, a genuinely like sickeningly evil thing that Malcolm X did. And he would remain unapologetically anti-Semitic until the day he died. And a lot of people like to say like later in life when he had like his big conversion and he started doing like more like,
Did he leave the Nation of Islam?
yes, he does eventually leave the Nation of Islam. And a lot of people like claim that that later in his life when he has like his sort of conversion, and starts to become like more like maybe black and white people should be working together instead. That he became like lighter on his anti-Semitism. Absolutely not. No. Just a few months before he died, he was telling reporters that Jews are bloodsuckers. Like this is an undeniable flaw in his character that just can't be swept under the rug. It was part of his story that we can't skip over. He was a virulent anti-Semite, and that's just part of what
That's
we
one
have.
of his character flaws. Everyone has character
Yeah,
flaws.
yeah. At one point, he actually does a public speaking appearance with George Lincoln Rockwell, and George Lincoln Rockwell is the founder of the American Nazi Party and the father of the neo-Nazi movement. And he does like a public speaking appearance with him where they both talk about like the commonalities that they have between their ideological beliefs and the beliefs of racial separatism. The anti-Semitism that just it's just a part of the story. We can't avoid it. It really sucks. It really sucks because it it is a real like the stain on his character. Um,
Um,
in
it's kind of like how we have been talking throughout the podcast that these characters that we kind of like place a little bit higher in our psyche slash the zeitgeist of history, like, hey, they did this great thing or they did that great thing. Like Alexander the Great is known as like an amazing conqueror, but he did some really horrific things.
yeah
Like a lot of almost everyone we've covered on the podcast has done some horrific things. That doesn't diminish their effect on our history.
yeah. Um, so alongside all of like the public appearances and the interviews that he's doing and stuff like that, in 1960 he was invited to be a guest at the official functions of a number of different African nations at the UN General Assembly, the United Nations General Assembly in New York City.
Damn.
And yeah, yeah, and while he was there at the UN General Assembly, he met Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. He met Ghanaian President Ahmed. Okay, sorry, some of these names I'm gonna have trouble with. Ghanaian President Ahmed Sekou Toure, and another guy, Kenneth Kanda, of the Zambian African National Congress. And he also ended up at kind of at the same time, he ended up becoming really good friends with Fidel Castro. So yeah, while Castro was in New York at the UN General Assembly, he took a day trip to Harlem and went
Interesting
and
choice. I would
yeah.
have never guessed that, but
Well, he was going to hang out with the poor and downtrodden, like because Harlem was a black neighborhood in New York City, so he was going to hang out with the poor and downtrodden minorities
he
in the
was
United
going for
States.
a PR stunt.
It was basically a PR stunt, but like yeah, there was genuine conviction to it for whatever that's worth. And he was really, really well liked by the black community in Harlem. There's you can actually look it up. There's videos of him like hanging out with like uh, and hanging out and like just having lunch with like black folk and like playing basketball with some kids and like it's really interesting. And it was during that visit that he and Malcolm X met and they hung out and talked about like their shared ideals and their shared struggles and things like that. And they would have remained like in correspondence and remained like lifelong friends. So yeah, for what?
That's not a connection I ever pictured in history, let alone knew about.
Yeah. So this is all going on for a number of years. We get into around 1962. That's when things kind of start
All
going,
right.
yeah, start going awry, start going sour between Malcolm and the Nation of Islam, specifically with Elijah Muhammad, and that's for a variety of reasons. So, real quick, let's go to Los Angeles on April 27th, 1962.
What happened in Los Angeles, 1962? That was actually a more of a tired flub than a drunk flub, but you could
Yeah.
probably blame both.
Yeah. So, on that day, two Los Angeles police officers began randomly beating several members of the Nation of Islam right outside their temple, on the sidewalk outside their temple.
That's fucked up.
It is fucked up. Um, and it's kind of stupid too because it turns out the entire congregation was in there because they were having a community event, and so they all rushed out and they beat the shit out of these two cops.
Fuck them pigs.
Yeah, fuck the pigs. Good for them. In the chaos, one of the cops tries to shoot into the crowd that's beating them, and accidentally shoots one of his buddies in the arm.
I love it.
And so
That
like
that's amazing.
this other cop's elbow is just fucked up for the rest of his life. He can't move his arm anymore because he got shot in the elbow. And then after this beating, uh, LAPD comes back with 70 guys, and they raid the temple.
That's just being poor losers.
Yeah, they're just sore losers. They raid the temple. Dozens of people are beaten, and 7 people are shot. One of them is killed. One of the people who was shot, he was shot in the neck, and he was paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of his life.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. The man who was killed, he was a Korean War veteran, and he was shot in the back of the head while his hands were in the air trying to surrender.
Fuck them pigs.
Fuck them pigs. The coroner ruled his killing justified.
Fuck that coroner.
Fuck that coroner. After this event, Malcolm was understandably enraged
No shit.
and disgusted and appalled, and he took the next logical step in sort of his ideological development, like the message he had been kind of like sending out for a while. He started publicly calling for members of the Nation of Islam to arm themselves and launch retribution strikes against their local police department.
At that point, I can't necessarily blame him.
It's not a good idea, but it is understandable. um, the problem was at this time. Elijah Muhammad was starting to make some changes to the organization's policies regarding their position on the civil rights movement.
What were these changes?
And basically, he was starting to like come out and publicly say like, we should probably be working with civil rights leaders a little bit more. And it's
Wasn't that really like the antithesis of what they were going for?
yes. Yes, they had been publicly opposed to the civil rights movement for a while. It's kind of debated why he wanted to make this change. Some people believe it was like just a genuine like ideological shift in him. Other people believe that it was like a cynical attempt to kind of latch onto the growing, because this is 1962. This is when the civil rights movement was really exploding.
Maybe he saw a
So
shot at like equalness, and he was like, I think more equal treatment's more realistic than us separating.
maybe that was it to a certain extent. Maybe it was just that he wanted to latch his organization onto the growing civil rights movement because he thought he could recruit more people through it. He thought he might be able to bring more people into Nation of Islam if he had the legitimacy of the expanding civil rights movement alongside it.
Damn.
And while these changes were going into effect, um, he thought that it was not a good look for an organization trying to reorient themselves towards the generally nonviolent civil rights movement for their main spokesperson to be talking about taking up arms and killing pigs.
I mean, one, fuck them pigs, but two, like after that happened, can you? It's hard to endorse any other statement from Malcolm's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Malcolm's perspective, he did not like this. He was kind of, as far
It,
as
it
like
he
cooperate.
seemed to be fully on the bandwagon as we need to be separate, not equal.
Well, yes, that is 100% true. But he was also very religiously observant, and to him, uh, to him, oh, excuse me, sorry. To him, Elijah Muhammad is his prophet. And so if Elijah was going to say maybe we should work with the civil rights movement more, Malcolm was fine with that. Like he might not wholly agree with it, but like if it was passed down by the authority
The
of
prophet, you
God's
can't
prophet,
really.
like yeah, it must have a point to it. It must be part of the plan. The real problem that he had was that he thought that Elijah was just ignoring this obvious, blatant attack on their organization, on their faith. And he thought that Elijah was being light and ignoring this
He
issue.
thought he was being weak.
Yeah. And so this
If he
started.
genuinely thought Elijah was a prophet and he was being weak, why wouldn't he have thought that maybe that's what God wanted?
Well, that's the thing. This is when it starts to the contradictions start to become a little much, and he's having to choose between the words of his prophet and his conviction in like the right of Black Americans to resistance and defiance to white supremacy. Elijah is now kind of putting him into that position through his inaction on the raid on the temple in LA. And that, just like it doesn't make sense to us, it didn't make sense to Malcolm either. And that's causing a contradiction that's eventually going to lead him down a road where he breaks with the Nation of Islam. But as this like early sort of schism is starting to happen within the Nation of Islam between Elijah and Malcolm, Elijah starts to block him from public speaking events and block him from meetings
Elijah
with.
starts distancing himself from Malcolm.
Yeah, pretty much, and kind of starts blocking him out of like leadership positions and leadership like discussions on like the direction of the nation. And and that's starting to cause bad blood. A little while later, in 1963, uh, the president of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, is,
Good old JFK.
yes, he is assassinated in Dallas, and he passes away, and the country is in mourning. While the country is in mourning, Malcolm is giving an interview, and they ask him what his thoughts are on the assassination of JFK. And he describes the assassination as, quote, chickens coming home to.
Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ.
Specifically, he cites three things specifically: um, the CIA-backed assassination of the Congolese president Patrice Lumumba, the murder of the civil rights leader Medgar Evers, and federal inaction on the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, which killed several children. Um, he cites all of these as like, well, yeah, of course your president got shot. It's karma. What goes around comes around. And when you phrase it like that, like, I still don't agree with it, but
He can't
man,
blame me for coming to that conclusion, even if I don't agree with it.
right, from his perspective, that's perfectly reasonable. But understandably, it still pisses everybody off. There is a huge public outcry throughout the country. Um, so after people become outraged at Malcolm's statements on JFK's assassination, Elijah Muhammad feels feels the need to come out and make a public statement denouncing Malcolm's words to the public and kind of undermining, uh, instead of having his back, kind of undermines him instead. Well, this is just another kind of step on the road to the further breakdown of like their relationship. Um, so the last nail in a coffin is a real fucking doozy. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this out now. Big, big content warning for this one.
Trigger
Uh,
warning, skip ahead
yeah.
if you get easily disturbed by violence, right?
No, not violence. Sexual assault.
I mean, technically violence, but not the kind I was talking about. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Specifically against children.
Oh, damn, you didn't warn me there was going to be.
Oh yeah.
Give me a
And
second to mentally prepare for this, Derek.
yeah.
Okay, hit me.
Um, so later in 1963, it comes out that Elijah Muhammad. First, it comes out that Elijah Muhammad had had affairs with several of his secretaries, which they're not.
As tends to unfortunately happen way too often, people tend to fornicate with their secretaries.
Yeah. Um, and if he had publicly apologized and he'd made amends for it, um, Malcolm probably would have stayed on board. But he didn't. Elijah decided that, actually, no, it's fine that I did this. And you know why? Because in the Bible and in the Quran, all of the prophets from our history have all had multiple wives. So it's okay that I slept with all of my secretaries.
Is that the same kind of excuse that they're going to use? He's going to use for the rape of children.
I believe so. I didn't see anything specifically regarding his defense of that. Um, but yeah, after that came out, there was a big sort of schism in the church or in the nation. And then shortly after that, it also came out that he had raped 8 underage girls, ranging in age from, I believe, 13 to 16.
Thank
And
God this man is dead.
I believe, and yeah, 7 of those 8 had become pregnant.
I think that Well, I'm not one to delegitimize whole religions as well. Like I, as much as I do not believe that the origin of Mormonism, even if you want to view from a Christian's perspective, is founded in reality, I try not to invalidate Mormonism as much as I don't believe the origin story. I think that invalidates the entire nation of Islam. Personally, if their main originating prophet does that,
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with you on that. And a lot of members of the Nation of Islam agreed, and they and a lot of people left the Nation of Islam after this event,
good,
after this came out,
good.
and that included Malcolm. He announced his break with the Nation of Islam in 1964. He he still believed in like nation like he was still Muslim, or at least the version of Muslim that the Nation of Islam had.
He
Um,
was essentially Nation of Islam, but like not officially tied to the
yeah, if it weren't
official
for
version.
yeah, a little while after this, he actually converts to Sunni Islam, so like normal Islam. But if he had stayed with like the same thing, it probably would have just been like a schism. He would have like founded his own version of Nation of Islam, and we would have had
Interesting to see the timeline where we have
two nations of
Malcolm
Islam.
X, Nation of Islam.
Yeah, especially like the public shit slinging fest that we'd have between Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan. That'd be a timeline.
Who is Louis Farrakhan?
He's the guy who takes over the Nation of Islam after Elijah Muhammad dies, and he
Okay.
he was his own brand of maniac. I think he was actually the
I don't
leader.
mean this literally, but I feel like anyone who splinters a religion is kind of insane.
Yeah, you.
And I don't mean that
Yeah.
literally. I mean that in like every time I've seen like a major religion splinter, the person who originates it sounds insane. The only
Although
one that's not insane was like the divorce one. King Henry or King George?
Henry VIII.
Henry VIII. I was close. I had the right name, whether it
Yeah,
was the right
you
Henry.
got the right name. I give you points for that.
Like that's the only one that's like kind of like not insane. Like it's a little bit insane, but it's not like the level of insane when you see other religions splinter. Like
Mm.
Mormonism is insane. From what I've heard about Nation of Islam, is insane. The
Ooh,
David Koresh Branch Dravidians, insane. Um, Jim Jones,
ooh,
insane.
ooh. I'd love to get really in depth into the Great Schism sometime.
One day, Derek, find the perfect topic.
Well, we kind of covered the Great Schism when we talked about the First Crusade. Anyways, so yeah, he broke with the Nation of Islam in 1964, and he announced that he would be forming a new black nationalist organization, which would seek to work alongside other civil rights organizations. Because by this point, his whole thing with the leadership of the Nation of Islam has kind of made him reevaluate a lot of his beliefs. And I think at this point, he was starting to kind of realize the virtue in working with other black leaders, regardless of his opinions on them. And this is when he's starting to change his mind on a lot of things at this point. After after what I'm about to talk about, it's gonna be changing a whole lot very quickly.
So he has a
Um,
very big worldview perspective shift coming up.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's gonna be really interesting because it's gonna be a relatively short period of his life, and it's but it's gonna be like a lot of the main thing that he's remembered for. Like as far as his religious stuff goes, everything that he's done so far is what he's remembered for, like his Nation of Islam stuff. But as far as his activism goes, what he's about to do is the main stuff that he's remembered for, and that has kind of
Damn.
cemented his legacy.
So this is the part that history truly like gives a damn about.
Um,
I
Looking
don't mean
back,
that.
like
I mean
yeah,
that the normal person gives a damn history, not like.
it's the part that had the biggest effect on like his legacy and what he kind of left behind. And it kind of makes it all the more tragic for how soon after this he passed. Um, so
If
after
he didn't pass when he did, like this is speculation. Do you think he would have continued to evolve as a person, or do you
Oh,
think?
absolutely, he was in a very transformative point in his life when he passed. He would have continued to evolve and to become just almost a different person from who he was before. And I'll explain it because it's gonna make a it's actually very inspiring, kind of how he gets to the point where he does, and it just does make his death genuinely tragic. So after leaving the Nation of Islam, he in fact actually founds two different organizations. Both of them are black nationalist organizations, but they're focused on different things. So one of them he founds is called Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which is a silly name. And that is sort of his continuation of like the religious part of his activism, the spreading of Islam to black Americans. Um, and then he founds another one, which is a slightly more important, like long lasting one, called the Organization for Afro American Unity. And that is his secular organization, the one dedicated to like political activism. And it becomes like probably his biggest legacy, what continues to carry on his sort of ideals after his death. Um,
Dang.
Around the same time, like I mentioned, he meets with several actual Muslims and ends up converting to Sunni Islam. So he abandons all of the stuff about Yaqub, the
The
and
insane version of Islam.
yeah, he stops believing white people are literal devils and now just believes they're metaphorical devils. But it's important because when he converts, he abandons like the more esoteric teachings of the Nation of Islam. Uh, it kind of grounds him in reality more. It kind of exposes him to like what is actually going on and like in like a material sense, and helps
Okay.
him reform his activism in a more positive direction, I'd say. It was during this time that he gave probably his most famous speech, one that he's most well remembered for. It's been nicknamed the ballot or the bullet speech. The and that's one of the terms that he's most well
Why was
like
it called that?
because during the speech is basically said like it's basically admitted like yeah it would it's probably a good thing for black Americans if we go ahead and start voting and keep and vote in order to make political change, but don't let it get in the way of the reality that might have to take up arms in order to defend ourselves from white supremacy. And he framed it in such a way that it's kind of it is the white supremacist American system that is giving them this choice. Uh, Either we can vote our rights into reality, or we can take it by force. We'll do it either by the ballot or by the bullet. Which
I mean,
which I'm not gonna lie, 100% agree with.
I
This is the
mean,
first thing he said
I
that I
would
have.
strive to make change through the system when possible, but at the end of the day, that's not always going to be possible. You got to have to work with that outside the system at some point.
Yeah, this is the first thing I've said that I pretty much completely agree with him on without reservation. Um, so this is 1964. Shortly after all of these events have transpired, he decides that if he's going to be a true, genuine, like faithful to faithful to the Prophet Muhammad, Muslim, that he has to carry out his obligation to go on his pilgrimage to Mecca, which is called the Hajj.
Muslims aren't the only ones who do that, right? 'Cause I thought Jews did that and a lot of Christians do too.
No, no, only Muslims do that.
Visiting Mecca, like
Yeah,
making a program.
yeah, that's only Muslims
I could have sworn I heard about Jews doing it too.
because Mecca was the Mecca was where in the in in the tradition of the Muslim faith, Mecca is where the Prophet Muhammad first experienced he first received his revelation from God and became the prophet. And so it's considered the holiest place in Islam. But you might be thinking of Jerusalem.
I'm just probably thinking of the Holy Land in general,
Yeah,
not
yeah. Jerusalem.
directly.
Jerusalem is holy to Muslims, Christians, and Jews.
That's probably what I'm thinking of as a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, not to Mecca.
Yeah, yeah. But Muslims are the only ones actually making the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, is an obligation. It's There are 5 obligations that all Muslims have to adhere to. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. I know one of them is pray 5 times a day, make the Hajj, the dietary restrictions, and then there's 2 others I can't remember off the top of my
The
head.
base part of my mind wants to say it's weird, but it's a cultural difference. It's not actually weird because like some people just are different that way.
So yeah, 1964, he decides he's gonna go ahead and do his Hajj, and take his pilgrimage to Mecca. So he takes a plane and he arrives in Riyadh, which is the capital of Saudi Arabia, which is where Mecca is. But when he arrives, he realizes how much his faith differs from the faith of like actual like practicing Muslims. Because when he gets there, um, he he's immediately detained by Saudi authorities because because he's telling them that he wants to take the Hajj, but it is in Saudi Arabia. It is literally illegal to enter Mecca if you're not Muslim.
Seriously?
Yeah, because it it's sacred land in Islam. It's not it. I don't know the exact logic they would use to justify it, but it's
Out of a lot of the, I would say out of all the Abrahamic religions, I feel like Islam is the more accepting of criticism that I've seen.
so imagine like from the Saudi authorities' perspective, an American man who cannot speak Arabic, does not know how to pray properly, does not know the basic tenets of Islam, arrives in your airport saying that he intends to visit and go on the Hajj. From their
I would probably sound like an insult.
Yeah, from their perspectives, this looks like just a random tourist trying to pretend he's Muslim to try to get into a holy site. So they detain him and they keep him for weeks. several weeks, almost a month, where he is just stuck in a little cell, just having to like the only human interaction he has are with his guards, which he eventually becomes pretty friendly with his guards, even though they can't speak the same language, and they start kind of the guards kind of figure out like what's going on. Like this guy is converted to some weird sect of Islam that doesn't have any connection to actual Islam, and is just trying to carry out his religious obligation without knowing what's going on. And so they're very hospitable. They're trying to like teach him like the basic tenets of basic Arabic, uh, and uh, and they start bringing him like whatever literature in English they can find to kind of uh, give him give him something that he can use to pass the time. And the only book they can really find in English is this book on like the basic tenets of Islam by like a local scholar who happens to be able to speak English, and his book has been translated in English. And
Okay.
so this is the only connection that Malcolm has to the outside world. And so there's nothing that he can do. He doesn't speak the language, so he can't kind of represent himself or explain himself. Nobody there speaks English, or he can't speak Arabic. None of them can speak English, so he can't communicate like what he's trying to do, what he's trying to accomplish. They can't explain like what he has to do to get out of this situation, like navigate the bureaucracy. And so the only thing he can do is try to find the only English speaker that he can see in his line of sight, which is the author of this book. And so he writes out a letter in English, is able to scrape together enough Arabic to tell these guys where to take this letter. And they take this letter to this guy in his home in Riyadh. This scholar, this
How
religious
far away
scholar.
was this from where he was being held? Do you know?
This it was in the same city. So like it
So
was just
it wasn't like a couple hour thing.
um
The drive, kind of like it wasn't like multiple cities away. Like
no.
it wasn't like a.
No, it was like they could get it there in like half an hour.
Okay, thank God.
So yeah. But it still does take a few days for them to be
Well,
able to act
obviously,
on it.
like
So this scholar, his son, he gets the letter, and his son goes and goes to the airport where he's being held in this cell, and takes and is able to act as a translator. And so they're able to translate, and they're able to get him released from this cell so that he can start the process for getting like a temporary visa. Um, and once he's out, people start to notice, because at this point, like he's done enough stuff like with internet, like national leaders from Africa and things like that. He's pretty well known in the Muslim world, because he's the most famous American Muslim on the planet at this point. And so people immediately recognize him and notice who he is once he gets out.
how did they not notice him before?
Well, because like the regular like guards, the regular like cops who are just running the customs authority in Riyadh, they don't know who he is. But once he gets out, like especially like because of his now connection with this famous scholar who wrote this book that he was able to use to get out, he has connections. He starts telling people that Malcolm X is now in Riyadh. And word starts to get around like the rich and powerful in Riyadh, and eventually makes its way to the royal house of Saud. And the crown prince at the time, the crown prince of the house of Saud, Prince Faisal, Faisal finds out that Malcolm is in the country, and he's like, "Oh, this is a really big deal. This is the famous American Muslim." So he declares that um, that Malcolm is a guest of the state, which basically just gives him free reign of the entire country with the economic, like the financial support of the Saudi government.
Damn, he got lucky.
Yeah. And so with this assistance, he's able to get like more more tutoring on like the basic tenets of Islam, like what he'll have to do to complete his Hajj and things like that. And he does it. He goes to Mecca and he does his pilgrimage. He does all of the ceremony involved in it. And this event, his trip to Mecca, is the most influential event that happens in his entire life.
God damn, with an already eventful life?
Yeah, because what he finds in Mecca is not black and Arab people celebrating their faith as like a symbol of like national separatism. What he finds there is people of all different races, all different colors. As he describes it, everyone from blonde, blue-eyed, white-skinned Caucasians to black Africans, all all stripped to robes and worshiping and celebrating uh, at this site.
So is this kind
And
of what takes him away from his supremacist mindset?
yeah, this is when he kind of turns away from black separatism. This is when he realizes, oh, the purpose of Islam is not to separate people; it is to unite people. The point, the and it changes the way he looks at his own liberation. He begins to see the goal less as complete separation from white people, but more in unity with white people under a single faith. Because he now realizes white people can be Muslim too. And Muslim is a unifying force. All of these different people with all of their different languages, but they're all united by a single faith that is bringing them together in this wonderful act of worship. And it is genuinely powerful for him, and it completely changes the way he views everything. And from here, he undergoes just a an incredible transformation in his entire perspective and the way that he does activism.
Damn.
When he comes home from when he leaves Mecca, he takes a new name. So everybody will still refer to him as Malcolm and Malcolm X, and that's what history remembers him as. But to himself and to his family and to his closest friends, he is remembered by the name Malik, which is the Arabicized version of Malcolm.
I didn't know that. So you meet a Malik, it's this Arab version of Malik.
Maybe not like one to one. I don't know if there is a one to one, but it is the closest like phonetically. So it's generally used. It can be used like interchangeably, and a lot. I know there's a lot of people who do. His new full name that he takes is el-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, which in Arabic translates as the Pilgrim Malcolm the Patriarch. And so that is his new name going into this new life.
Okay.
So after he leaves Mecca, he takes a visit to meet Prince Faisal and pay his respects, thank him for his assistance, and then he leaves Saudi Arabia and he goes on a tour of Africa. So he's going to a bunch of like the major capital cities and the major political and cultural centers all around Africa, giving speeches wherever he goes, meeting people, meeting leaders, dignitaries. Everywhere he goes in Africa, he is welcomed as a celebrity. He is a celebrity. He's considered like a hero to many of these people. Three different national leaders that he meets offer him jobs as ministers in their government.
Most people don't meet three leaders of nations, let alone get offered positions of power.
Yeah. And he met, I think, like a dozen different like national leaders
He
during
met
this
a
tour.
lot. He met Castro at the very least. Didn't he meet the leader of Egypt?
Yeah.
He's met the prince of Saudi Arabia at the very
Yeah.
least.
Yeah. And
That you've
just,
told me in this story. So that's three minimum.
yeah. And he he also meets the president of Ghana and one of like a major
Oh, he
political
also
leader
met Castro, so that's four.
you already mentioned Castro.
Did I mention?
Yeah, he's the
I
first one.
said, did I?
Yeah.
I'm. I am 4 beers, 5, 6 shots deep.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know how many shots deep I am. Okay.
But yeah, at one stop he makes while he's in Nigeria, he gives a speech at the University of Ibadan, and while after he gives his speech, the Nigerian Muslim Student Association welcomed him as a guest, and they bestowed him the honorary name of Omuwale, which is in the language in one of the languages in the main language in Nigeria is Yoruba. In Yoruba, Omuwale translates as the son who has come home.
Interesting.
And late afterwards, Malcolm, like when he was presented with this honorary name that they gave him, he broke down crying. It was the first and only time that anybody had ever seen him cry in public. And he considered it the greatest honor he received in his entire life.
I I can't say I would not be in the same position as him. Like, to have visited a nation and they consider me a person they view as family who has returned to their home.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know, I kind of get teary eyed thinking about that too. That's like
Could you imagine, Derek, that one, like, the podcast goes big, you're very active in activism, you're making a similar kind of difference to Malcolm, and you visit Germany and they bestow you a new name that means someone who has returned home. I know it's not a one-to-one, but like that's what I could think of at the moment.
yeah, I get exactly what you're saying though. Like, I don't know, for me it's different because I've never considered like Germany home or something I go back to. Like my heritage is in Texas. Like I am a Texan. Like I'm a German Texan, but I'm still a Texan. That's what I consider like my identity. But I get exactly what you mean though. So after this tour, he returns to the U.S. and one stop that was noticeably absent from his trip in Africa was a stop in the Congo, because the Congo was at that time ruled by a dictator by the name of uh, I think it's pronounced Moshe Tshombe.
Isn't that where there's like a proxy war occurring right now in the Congo?
There is a genocide going on in the Congo right now. I don't know if it's a proxy war, but
I could have sworn there was like corporate bullshit and proxy
oh,
bullshit.
there has always been corporate bullshit going on in the Congo. I'm sure the U.S., France, and Belgium are involved in some way. I just couldn't tell you exactly how. But
Okay.
but yeah, at this point in the Congo is ruled by a dictator who is backed by the CIA, and
Which has happened bajillion times in history.
yeah, this one was unique because this was one of the first times that it had happened back in like the mid 50s. because
Wow.
the first democratically elected president of Congo after it was after it was made independent, or ostensibly supposed to be made independent from Belgium, was the this guy Patrice Lumumba. And Patrice Lumumba became like one of the most important figures for like the international decolonization effort. He was a very powerful leader, very strong advocate of social justice and for turning he was like the symbol of the vision of a decolonized Africa rising to the prosperity and the greatness of the rest of the world. And
Okay.
but the problem was he wanted to nationalize all of the rare earth minerals in the Congo, which
Which doesn't set well with any capitalist nation because they want to send their
yeah.
corporations in and take advantage of it.
Yeah, and so Belgium and the US, the CIA teamed up and helped this general named Moshe Tshombe alongside like a bunch of white European mercenaries. They overthrew and murdered Lumumba. And so Congo was the only major African nation that he wasn't able to visit. And so when he got back to the US, he started this huge campaign against American support for Tshombe and speaking out against like the horrific crimes being committed by Tshombe's like European mercenaries against the Congolese people. So when when Malcolm got back to the United States, he very quickly became the most in demand speaker on college campuses across the country. And he took every single speaking gig that he could possibly fit into his schedule. And this time around, he didn't just limit himself to all black venues. He started speaking to mixed race crowds, black and white. And he started talking about, he was still very militant. He was still talking about like the necessity of like armed self-defense and the rights of black people to take any means necessary to liberate themselves. But he also started talking about like opening up to the idea of like white allyship and like racial
He was
cooperation.
open to the intermingling of races where, like, hey, whites aren't the literal devil. We can cooperate. We can work together. We can accomplish a common goal.
Yeah. Yeah. And he also like he also started talking to like a lot of like sort of ostensibly aligned groups that he had very much badmouthed in the past, like not just like as far as like civil rights groups goes, but like socialist organizations as well. He became very open to like socialist organizing, and very famously he gave a speech at the Militant Labor Forum, which was a discussion forum put on by the Socialist Workers Party, and which is, you know, admittedly a Trotskyist group, which I'm not a fan of, but you know, we take
You act like I know what Trotskyist means.
it. I'll explain it sometime. It's not important, but we
Not today, but someday.
yeah, and yeah, he just there's a couple stories that come out of this period that I really like. One of them comes directly from his autobiography. It's a story. One day, he is driving down the road and he's waiting at a stoplight, And next to him, a car pulls up next to him in the other lane, and they're both stopped. And the white man who's driving the other car next to him rolls down his window and recognizes him and says, "You're Malcolm X, right?" And he says, "Yes, I am." And he says, the white man says, "I really admire what you're doing. I have a great respect for you and your mission. Would you shake a white man's hand?" And Malcolm says, "I won't shake a white man's hand, but I'll shake a brother's hand." So you can kind of that's a story
See the 180 he's taken.
yeah, that's a story he himself told. Also, during a lot of these speeches that he's giving, he starts speaking out against the Nation of Islam, and he starts speaking about how like they're a corruption of the Muslim faith, and they're going to lead Black Americans down a dark path and things like that. And as a result, the Nation of Islam starts making death threats against him.
No shit. Most religious organizations don't like former members completely denouncing them and saying, "Hey,
Yeah.
you're a corruption of the original faith."
Yeah, especially the guy who recruited like 90% of their membership.
Yeah, doesn't help.
Amongst some of these death threats he received, he and his family began receiving threatening calls in the middle of the night. The the newspaper that the Nation of Islam prints, I think it's called Elijah Speaks. I think that's what it's called. They start printing cartoons in their paper, which depict Malcolm being decapitated.
Because of course they were going to do that.
Yeah, this is. Louis Farrakhan, or who at this point he's known as Louis X, but later he'd be known as Louis Farrakhan. He starts publicly saying yeah, somebody should just bomb this guy's car. Somebody should just put him.
Christ!
And there is some evidence that some of his followers did start making plans to do something like that. Yeah, it never got to like the actual execution stage, as far as we know, but it was a serious consideration. So, in response to all of these death threats, Malcolm made it very clear in his speeches that he was not concerned or afraid by these threats, because either they were empty or they weren't, and in which case he knew how to defend himself.
Fuck him. That's what he said. He said, "Fuck him."
Yeah, there's this really famous picture of him where he's kind of standing in front of a door, looking out from behind the curtains out a window
with a
while he's holding a
gun with him. I saw that when I was looking when you talked about how attractive he was.
Yeah, he's that picture was taken by a reporter for Ebony magazine, and it was published alongside an article about his defiance against the death threats being made to him by the Nation of Islam. On February 21st, and this is where we get to the tragic bit. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm was giving a speech to he was giving a speech for his organization, the OAAU, at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. During the speech, there is a disturbance in the crowd where a man is heard to yell, "Inward, get your hand out of my pocket." And this caused, understandably, at a a speech given by a black civil rights organization. This is understandably causes a bit of a commotion. And during the commotion, as Malcolm is trying to get everybody back under, like, calm everybody down, get everything back under control, a man rushes from out of the crowd right up to the podium where he's giving his speech and shoots him point blank in the chest with a sawed-off shotgun.
God damn, he went with out like a Shinzo Abe.
Oh, hold on. After the shot, two more men come on to the stage like from the sides of the stage, both of them firing pistols directly into Malcolm.
Oh, he got triple tapped.
He got triple tip, yeah.
Holy shit!
The three gunmen fled before they could be apprehended. Or two of them fled. One of them was actually captured by the crowd and nearly beaten to death. But two of them escaped. The Malcolm was taken to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead the same day. The coroner reported that he had suffered 21 gunshot wounds.
What?
10 of those were from pellets from the buckshot from the shotgun.
That's 11 handgun
And
wounds.
11 handgun wounds. It was discovered that the one gunman who was apprehended on scene was a member of the Nation of Islam.
Fuck you, that's a shot, isn't it?
No, that wasn't a cop.
Oh, it's a cop, so that's 3 sips then.
Yeah.
I got him flopped in my head.
Yeah. Well, hold on. We'll get there, though. You don't have to take it if you're feeling bad.
Oh, I ain't feeling bad. I just like... I kind of thought you had guessed wrong, and I was like, oh, I don't have to take the shot. Yay! In my head.
So, later on, two more men who were also members of the Nation of Islam were also arrested and were charged with his murder. And all three men were sentenced to life in prison. Later on, the two other men, not the guy who was apprehended on scene, but the two other guys who were arrested later, both of them were exonerated a couple decades later.
Oh, really now?
Because it came out that the police had hidden evidence during the trial.
Fucking pigs.
Yeah. So we're fairly certain that they weren't the ones who did it. But there's still a possibility that they were, but we're fairly certain that they weren't involved and that the two other gunmen kind of just faded off into history. Later on in the 1970s, the public becomes made aware about COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO is a shortened name for the FBI's, what they called their counterintelligence program.
Fuck the FBI.
Fuck the FBI. So yeah, the public became aware of COINTELPRO, and a shitload of documents pertaining to COINTELPRO were declassified. And the purpose of COINTELPRO was to infiltrate and disrupt different quote-unquote extremist groups in the United States. Specifically, they mainly targeted like civil rights groups and left-wing groups.
Not surprised in the least bit.
Yeah. Many of the documents released revealed that not only was there an extensive surveillance file on Malcolm X, including including like phone taps. Like we have records of a lot of the conversations that Malcolm had in the later part of his life, just because the FBI was recording all of his phone calls. Uh,
I reiterate, fuck
but
the FBI.
fuck the FBI. But it also came out that a lot of high ranking members of the Nation of Islam were actually FBI agents.
That tracks. That
In,
absolutely tracks.
including the National Secretary of the Nation of Islam, John Ali, who was basically the second in command of the entire organization.
God damn.
He was also one of the most vocal critics in opposition to to Malcolm X, and was one of the guys who spearheaded um, like the death threats campaign against him.
Again, that tracks.
Yeah, this was the guy that Malcolm once referred to as his mortal enemy. Yeah, he was an FBI agent.
Sounds about white.
Yeah. So today, Malcolm X is one of the most well known and also misunderstood figures of the civil rights era. Uh,
Honestly, I'm glad to have learned about him through this rather than our shitty public education system.
nah,
Because, like, he was only a passing figure. We didn't actually learn about him in my education.
yeah.
Because I guarantee they would have done a bang up job that would have probably biased me if I had actually learned about him.
No. When I was a freshman in high school, I had a black English teacher who actually taught us about Malcolm X, and like a genuine, actual, like, trying to get us to understand his ideas. My dumb ass, all of it just went right over my head. I didn't retain any of it. So today in the black community, which, let's be honest, it's the only opinion that matters on the topic. But today in the black community, Malcolm is generally viewed as an icon of black empowerment, but he's interpreted in a large variety of ways. A lot of people emphasize his social ideals of like militant masculinity and his like concept of like black self-respect, and emphasize that as like a as the like his most important aspect, and very much like idolize that part of his activism. Um, Others emphasize like his promotion of black separatism. There's still a pretty prominent black separatist movement that sees him as like one of their major foundational figures. Um, Others emphasize his introduction of Islam as a method for black liberation from like white Christian America. There's Islam is still like a it's not a huge part of like black America today, but it's definitely there and definitely noticeable and something that people take note of. And not all of it is related to the Nation of Islam. There are a lot of just like black folk who just convert to like regular Islam, and that was first put on the radar in black communities by Malcolm X. Um, and a lot of people, like myself for a long time, uh, emphasize his activism in his later years, when he attempted to kind of bridge the gap between black self determination and coexistence with whites. That is a big part of his legacy that a lot of people remember him for, despite the fact that it was only part of his activism for less than a year before he was killed.
Damn. I
Yeah.
want to see the timeline where he didn't die so soon.
Yeah. You know who else did? Martin Luther King Jr. He he spoke and wrote extensively on how tragic it is that Malcolm died when he did, when he was just in the middle of this incredibly important transformation in his personal ideology and his approach to black activism. Because it just, he had come so far and had completely changed. And he was still in the middle of changing and adjusting and creating like a new ideology and identity for himself in the public sphere. And it's considered like one of the great tragedies, like where he would have led and where he would have gone and what his talents would have done for black America if he had been allowed to continue it. There are many who criticize him for a variety of reasons, both legitimate and not. Um, as far as the not legitimate reasons, in my opinion, um, his promotion of violence as a tool for liberation. Um, Oftentimes, it is very much overblown. He's kind of presented as like this psychotic maniac who just advocated for like the bloodthirsty murder of all white people, which is just absolutely not true. It's never anything that he ever spoke on or promoted. He promoted black people forming their own communities and forming their own way of life separate from white America and defending that separateness with arms if necessary. That is what he promoted, and it he was fully aware and fully willing to use violence if, in his opinion, it needed to be done. But it was not and never was his first mode of action. In fact, he himself, the man himself, beyond like some fist fights in his youth, was never involved in any form of violence. It could never be connected to any form of violence by his followers.
See,
He,
that was the big contradiction that I got in this episode. Is well, I had never heard of any specific instances of him directly being involved in violence. Everything I had heard about him, that he was violent, that he called directly, like said, "Hey, go attack," like not literally, but
yeah,
like in essence had said that.
yeah.
When I don't know if the impression I got was even 1% close to his actual representation.
Yeah, he learning about his actual life, he is so far from like the general image that he has, especially as us as white guys. Like he's so far from what we were kind of led to believe that
I don't want to say he was called a boogeyman, but like I he was used almost as a boogeyman to the people of his day. Like that's how he was described to me. Like he was like a really I grew up hearing that he was basically the evil version of Martin Luther King Jr. Not literally, but like if you want to boil it down.
um yeah, that's absolutely the interpretation I'd always heard. Everybody growing up, everybody in my life always made such a great hay about Martin Luther King Jr., which he absolutely deserves in his own right. But whenever Malcolm X came up, it was always as a foil to Martin Luther King.
I heard of him as the anti-peaceable version of Martin Luther King Jr.,
Mm.
which with the Nation of Islam, you could argue, but that's not who he was when he died.
Yeah, I would argue that's not even who he was, like, with the Nation of Islam to a certain extent. Like, he, it was his own unique thing. It, it's not, it's not a comparison.
It's
It's
not a
so,
proper
yeah,
comparison that is accurate within history because that's not
yeah.
really what happened.
Yeah, and really the only reason that that sort of like stunted comparison is made in the first place is
Racism.
because it is racism. It's trying to co-opt the memory of MLK to tell black people that like we'll fix your problems if you just stay quiet and don't cause too much trouble. Because if you do cause too much trouble, you'll just be a Malcolm X. And it's fucking infuriating. I mean, I've I've talked a lot. I don't know if I've talked about it on the show, but I've talked a lot about like how fucking infuriating it is how the way that MLK's legacy has been fucking co-opted the way that it has. Um,
Um, I don't think we've talked about this, but like, I guarantee I already know your kind of maybe not nuanced sentiment, but your general sentiment. Like, the way we talk about MLK today, the way we talk about Malcolm X is vastly different from their historical context that they were in.
mhm. Yeah. And so that, in my opinion, is an illegitimate criticism of Malcolm X. He wasn't like a violent, like murderous psychopath. He was a
Oh, he is
deeply,
like the boogeyman he's made out to be that I grew up hearing about is not even 1% of what I've heard from you today.
yeah. But there are like legitimate criticisms you could make of him.
I didn't say he was free of
Yeah.
criticism. I just said he
Oh
is not
yeah,
the
yeah. No, I'm not.
boogeyman
I'm
he was
just
made out to be.
yeah. I'm just trying to continue my line of thought.
Oh, sorry.
So,
Continue.
but yeah, there are legitimate criticisms you could make of the man. Um, his the ideology, the methods, the practices, the concepts that he instilled in the black community, many of which were obviously positive. But for example,
I
the
want to call
blatant,
back to
the
the point where he was like, "Don't do this to spite the white man. Don't improve yourself in spite of the white man.
yeah,
Do it for yourself. Make yourself better because it's better for you." That was a like. Don't take it for like individual context. Don't do things out of spite. Don't do things because it will fuck with the person you hate. Do it because it will make you a better person. That is the best thing to take from that specific part of Malcolm.
yeah. Um, but like his ideals on like the family unit and the obvious like obvious misogyny that he showed throughout his life and through his teachings, his ideals, were obviously like not positive aspects of his teachings. And from what I've seen with like my with like black women that I've talked to, there is an issue with misogyny in the black community, and I feel comfortable saying that based on the conversations that I've had with black women talking about their experiences. I think just in general, like the very conservative approach that Malcolm X took to black self determination and those concepts. I think they, from what I've seen from the conversations that I've had with my black friends, have had like a negative effect And I'm not gonna say that like Malcolm was the impetus for those. I'm sure many of those issues have been like long been issues, just like they have been in pretty much every community on the planet. But his promotion of them and the effect that he had in ingraining ideals like that into modern black culture is something to be noted when discussing his legacy. And of course,
It is.
of course I would be remiss if I didn't also once again mention his glaring issue of anti-Semitism. Just it,
While he may have corrected at the end days, it doesn't change the fact that his initial anti-Semitism
well, he didn't
let
change.
didn't he when he accepted Islam and how the coming together of races when he converted to true Islam and like had his whole journey to Mecca changed his point of view.
It changed his point of view for white people, but like
So
after
wait, this
after
man had
his
issue with other races besides just white?
yeah, specifically he had a pretty bad history with Jews. He was
Okay.
yeah, I mentioned this earlier. Um, he was very often throughout his entire life outspoken about his opinions, his negative opinions on Jews. He introduced the protocols of the Elders of Zion into the Nation of Islam, um, and even like after his Hajj, like just a few months before his death, during an interview that he gave, he described Jews as bloodsuckers. So it because he heavily associated Jewishness with uh, the the white supremacist economic power structure that oppressed black people financially in the United States. It's just
Damn.
yeah, it just your classic standard like conspiratorial anti-Semitism that he he very much did publicly promote and did become a part of the teachings that he left behind that became such a prominent part of black culture and the way that black people interpret their existence within a white supremacist American society. And that is an unmistakable sin on his character that cannot be overlooked.
No, it can't.
But beyond all of that, like the whole view of the man himself as such an important figure in developing, I think if I could put it in my own words, the most important thing that he did was instill a sense, would create, almost invent from whole cloth, like a sense of black distinctiveness that had not existed in the community prior to him. And
I am unsure if I would phrase it that way. I don't say you're wrong. It's just like maybe I would put it like a new black identity.
kind of, yeah, there I mean there always been a black identity in the United States just by virtue of they're forced to be separate from white America. But I think that what he did was promote a concept of blackness that was both distinct from white Americanism, but also something to be distinctly proud of in its own right. Which I think was, speaking as somebody who's like been trying to identify, like explore my own like lineage and
Unconscious
heritage.
biases, but also like
No, like trying to explore like my own like heritage and my own identity in the context of like American white supremacy. Is it really resonates with me, that kind of legacy that he left behind. And I think that's something very important that I sympathize with very deeply for the black community.
Any final words, Derek?
Uh,
Because we've been here a while.
yeah, yeah, we have. Nope, I've said my piece.
I have two. Where can they find you, Derek?
They can find me on Twitter at Visigoth. The first I is a 1, the O is a 0. They can find me on Blue Sky at Visigoth. The first I is just a regular I, the O is a 0. Tim, where can they find you and all the podcast stuff?
So they can find me both on Blue Sky and Twitter at Tim, aka Otis. They can find the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at the Alexander Society Pod. They can find us on Twitter and Blue Sky at Alex Society Pod. And they can find us on TikTok at Alexander Society, where we will post snippets of outtakes from the episodes, but we will also try and post beer reviews. I'm going to hound Derek right here to post a couple more reviews because I know he can do at least a couple right off the bat. Whether we get them posted right now or not is another story. And I've got like 3 or 4 beers I can review too. If you've liked what you've listened to today, please give us a rate and review on your streaming platform of choice. And we hope we see you next time. Have a good one.